welcome to IISS. I wonder what Clausewitz would have made of PowerPoint and laptops. He'd have probably, in his masterwork, identified them as a factor that contributes to friction. But of course, one of Clausewitz's great contribution was his identification of the Trinity, the army, the people and the state. And of course, we would now say the armed forces as a whole and the people and the state. And he identified in his inimitable way how important public support for the military was as a factor both in peacetime and in war. And we've seen over the last 15 years or so the best part of 2 decades of wars that became increasingly unpopular, but the actual popularity of the military as a whole didn't always reflect that unpopularity. And both the United States and the UK and European publics have some quite complex relationships with the military in terms of their popularity and also their understanding of what they do. We've got a real expert to talk to us about that, Professor Peter Feaver, who's Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Duke University. He's also been a practitioner, having worked both the Clinton and the Bush administration on practical issues of getting national security done. So he's commissioned some very interesting work and he's done some very interesting analysis of it. He's going to share it with us for about half an hour, after which there'll be an opportunity for discussions. Peter.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I think this is the first time I've had the privilege of speaking at IISS, but of course I've admired it from afar my whole professional career. And I am going to talk to you about one of the 2 big baskets of issues that make up the study of civil-military relations in the United States. One of the baskets, the one I'm not going to talk about, but we can get there in Q&A, is built around a paradox that the U.S. has a very good record of civilian control of the military. No coup, no real coup attempt, not even a plausible rumor of a coup, except in minor strained conditions. On the one hand, and yet every Secretary of Defense who came in since the post was established, up until Mattis, came in believing that the civilian control had waned under his predecessor and he had to reassert civilian control. So that paradox of strong historical record of civilian control, strong historical record of worrying, fretting about civilian control. Much of the study of American civil mil falls into that basket, including things like just the story today that the president is seeking to restore the trident, the marker that distinguishes someone as a Navy SEAL, to Chief Gallagher, who was accused of war crimes. And so the president is meddling into that kind of thing. That's a first basket issue. I want to talk to you about a second basket issue that's more at the societal military level, the military's relationship to the society. And in the U.S., here we go. In the U.S., this is framed by a different paradox. On the one hand, the American public expresses persistently high confidence in the military. In fact, it's the institution, the public institution, in which the public has the highest degree of confidence in America, on the one hand. On the other hand, a very low propensity to join the military, a very low understanding of the military. So you have high regard at a high sense of remove. This is also sometimes called the civil-military gap question, or the problem of the 1% and the 99%, 1% that bears the military burden and 99% that does not. And that raises the question of what explains public confidence and why should we care? And the project that I'm working on now with Jim Golby, who's a military officer, works at NATO, but got his PhD from Stanford and is one of the up-and-coming stars in the field of American civil mil. he and I are working on this project. We're really exploring why was I wrong 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, I worked in this on this project. I warned that public confidence in the military was brittle, would unlikely to maintain the high levels, and 20 years later, clearly I was wrong. So I'm trying to figure out why I was wrong. So what we did is we're going to do 2 waves of surveys. We did a very large one this summer, and one of the problems of studying this issue is that the poll number, it just comes from a Gallup poll, has been asked many, many, many times. So there's lots and lots of longitudinal data supporting this high public confidence. But very few of the polls, really none of the polls, were designed to really explore it, why the public has high confidence in the military. For the existing polls, it's just one of a number of things the pollsters were interested in. So we designed a poll explicitly to dig into this question. And so I'm going to present some of the results for you today. We accumulated way too much data. This is a classic problem for research in this area. Every small finding we have raises 5 more questions, and you'll see that some of the things that we found do not align with what we expected, so they just raise new questions that we're going to explore. But I'm confident that this is the best data in the world currently for understanding U.S. public's attitudes towards the U.S. military in this confidence domain. There's lots of speculation about what might be propping up public support. So perhaps it's just the sense that the military works, the military is successful, unlike many other institutions the American public watches and seems utterly dysfunctional. So perhaps it's just public are confident in a competent institution. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that the military holds itself to very high professional ethical standards, and the public can see the contrast between a ethical institution like the military and unethical, sordid behavior elsewhere. A third possibility, and this was the one that I leaned on in my own work 20 years ago, was that perhaps the public views the military as above politics, nonpartisan, apolitical. And when I started in this business, I used to say there's 2 institutions that the public has a high degree of confidence: the military and the Supreme Court. Those were 2 that stood apart from others. But over the course of last 20, 25 years, public confidence in the Supreme Court, the highest judicial court, has plummeted. And the reason for that, I and others have speculated, is that the Supreme Court came to be viewed as a partisan institution. It was 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, 1 confused individual, and that made the Supreme Court look like Congress, which is a partisan institution that the public doesn't like. And I warned the military, don't look like you've developed a partisan identity. So perhaps that's it. So the survey experiments are useful tools for exploring if that's the case. And so we did a number of survey experiments to explore these hypotheses. The first one is an experiment based on the Afghan. The part in red is the experimental treatment. So we broke our sample down into groups of 3. 1/3 would get a control, just asking them the standard Gallup question, which is the top and the bottom there, and how much confidence do you have in the military? And then 2/3 would receive more information. One of those groups would receive information that said primed them to think that the U.S. had won and had achieved its goals in Afghanistan. The other primed them to think that the U.S. had not achieved its goals. So you can see how we expect that when you tell them that the military has done well, that would increase public support relative to the control. And if you tell them that the military has not done well, that would decrease it. So that was, you can see with the expectation. We also asked them about military ethics. And here, one of the experimental treatments told them that only a small percentage of generals and admirals on active duty have behaved badly. And then the other one said more than 300 separate cases. And of course, these are actually the same, referring to the same fact, right? 300 is a small percentage. We have plenty of general and flag officers in the United States, but one was designed to reinforce how ethical the institution is. One was designed to reinforce the idea that it was an unethical organization. And then we did partisan treatments. One that called attention to the high number of Republicans, particularly openly Republican statements, particularly on social media, Facebook, Twitter, those kinds of things. And then the second one suggesting that actually there's lots of Democrats. Now here, for those of you who are social scientists, you know you have to get special permission from your institutional review board to lie to your respondents, and so that we got special permission because that's technically not true. The top statement is true. The one that suggests that they're becoming more Democrat, that is technically not true. And after the survey, we had to alert the respondent that we had lied to them here if they received this treatment. We got one very angry response, emailed back to us, "How dare you do this? This is dishonoring to America," et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it was worth it, but when you see the results, you may decide with the guy who was angry at me. And then we also explored something that's even more true today than was true 20 years ago, and that is the hyperpolarized partisan environment. So this is a phenomenon that you're well aware of here in the UK, of course, but in the United States, it's the moving to the wings. It used to be that there were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. Not the case anymore. Now the most liberal Republican is still more conservative than the most conservative Democrat in political office at the federal level, but also more and more at the wings, at the extreme conservative, extreme liberal. And so we argue that similar things, polarization, openly partisan polarization, is showing up in the military as well. So those were the treatments. I'm now going to walk you through some of the results. Just this slide shows that we were able to reproduce the same results as the Gallup poll. So that's good to start at the baseline. These are the people who received the control at the top, and 75% overall say that they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the military. That's at the top of U.S. government institutions, and that's really a remarkable degree of confidence. It's interesting to note that it's of the military as a whole and not the military leaders, so it doesn't seem to attach directly as strongly to the leadership, but it's still pretty high. And they don't distinguish between retired and active. And this is a separate side thing we explored, which I won't talk to you today, but it was to what extent does the public distinguish between retired and active? And the answer is they really don't, not at the senior levels. That's a distinction that means a lot to those of us in the business, but to the average American, not so much. I want to draw your attention, though, to a partisan gap inside public confidence. That public confidence is propped up by an amazing 90% of Republicans who express a great deal or quite a lot of confidence. And there's a nearly 30-point drop between them and independents. Democrats are still quite high at 70, but the high levels of public support for the military is driven in part by this extraordinarily high partisan confidence by Republicans. Okay, let's look at the results. Well, one more slide. This is Migos slide, and your eyes glaze over. I don't want to break it down by the demographics. I just want to call your attention to one thing which we're not really exploring right now, but is one we flagged for senior leadership: the race gap. On all of our questions, and it's not just our survey, but many other surveys have shown that there is a strong race gap, that African Americans have by 20, 30 points lower degrees of confidence in the military, propensity to serve in the military, pride in the service, however you word the question, there is a difference between white and African American affect and response, whether they're veterans or non-vets. There's a striking race gap, and of course there's a gender gap as well, and there's something of a generational gap. So the younger generation has much less confidence. Okay, let's look at the results. I'll just stand up for a second, and I want you to look at the one in the middle here. This is the one that performs exactly how we want. So if you're above the red line, that's compared to the control. The control just was asked, how much confidence do you have? And if you're above it, that means we pushed up your support relative to people who did not receive. And if it's below, we pushed down. And the whiskers show statistical significance. So you can see that the Afghan treatment did exactly what we wanted it to do. Right? When we told them that they won, it went up a little bit. Not much, and that's understandable because it's already at a high level. There's a ceiling effect. There's only so much further it can go. But you tell them that they lost, and public confidence drops quite a bit. And so one of our policy takeaways is how the Afghan war is framed once it ends, whenever it ends, will redound to public attitudes towards the military. And if it's framed as we lost it, then there will be an issue. This, though, took us by surprise. Telling them that they're unethical, that greatly drops public support. We expected that. Telling them that only a few percentage do it also drops it. And that was not what we expected. This should have been up here above the red line, but it's below the red line. We're not sure what that means. Our post hoc explanation is that perhaps the public has such a high initial expectation that just bringing in any doubt about it lowers it. They certainly distinguished, they saw the several hundred, and that produced a dramatic effect. But even just telling them a few percentage, that's high. That's more unethicalness than the public wants. So these are the ones that surprised us. This one is. But telling them that it's Republican had just a tiny drop. Telling them as Democrat had a bigger drop. And when I get to the next slide, you'll see what. Telling them as polarized, which we thought would have the lowest. We thought it would go like this, and then down here, actually moves it up more than any other finding. And this, I'll tell you right now, I don't have a good explanation for it. I can speculate about it, but I don't have a good explanation for it. Okay, so let's move to the next. This is a hard to read, but this just shows you who's doing the movement. So Democrats and Republicans move down when they're told that it's lost. Independents move up when you tell them that they won. So it's actually, we infer that Democrat and Republican attitudes about the Afghanistan war have locked in about the degree to which it's a success. You might be able to move independents a little bit, but telling them that they lost, that's when you lose the partisans on either side.
Peter, you might just decode the colours.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. This is, everyone in America knows red is a Republican and blue is Democrat, and gray is independent. I'm sorry. That's a convention on the other side of the pond. Normally I wear a purple tie just to indicate that I'm neutral. Okay. The unethical is really what's driving the effect is Democrats. Democrats have a high view, we infer, of how ethical the organization is, and primed to think about general officers behaving badly has a big effect. Here, things are responding as you would expect. Telling the Democrats that the military is Republican lowers support for them. It actually raises it just a tiny bit for Republicans. There's not much room for it to raise, but it does raise it just a little bit. Republicans already are very, very high. Telling them that it's Republican nudges it up just a wee bit. Likewise, telling Republicans that it's Democrat drops it. That's the one thing that moves Republicans a lot, is if they thought that the military had a Democratic cast. You put that together, though, then it should drive. If you would expect that these should combine and lower it for polarization. If you tell them that there's lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans, it should go down. It doesn't do that. It moves it up. It's a mystery. The way to interpret these findings is that the Republicans have started to view the military as their institution. There's an identification, almost a tribal identification, that the military is theirs. Democrats likewise have a view of that, but they're still able to have high levels of confidence. But for Republicans, it's driven heavily by partisanship. The other question we asked ourselves was, is there something of a social pressure to say that you like the military? This is the political psychologists call this social desirability. Everyone knows what's the correct answer, and sometimes they just give the correct answer to the polls because, of course, you don't want to be seen as socially incorrect. Perhaps there's high levels of support for the military because everyone believes that there's high levels of support and they want to join with it. And so we did another survey experiment that nudged the public one way or the other. One, trying to goose it up by talking about all this high level of support. One, showing that actually it's dropping and can we move it down? And that does perform exactly as we would expect. So when the control is at 86, still extraordinarily high, but we can nudge it up by by this social pressure, telling people that lots of other people are feeling the same way. Shouldn't you feel this way? Is the implied effect, and telling them that it's dropped has a change, but as the whisker bars suggest, it's not a statistically significant change. So there's movement in the directions that you would want, but maybe not a lot of movement. So we tried to tap this in another way through something called a list experiment. I don't know if you've seen a list experiment, but the way it works, this was designed to get people to reveal racist attitudes. So at some point in the last 3-4 decades, it became understood that you do not openly tell a polling firm that you're a racist. And so they developed this experiment which allowed them to find out latent attitudes that the public might not want to reveal to the pollster. And so the way you do it is you come up with a list of 5 in the control and 6 in the treatment. The 6th, the experimental treatment, is the one you're trying to measure. So that's quite a lot of confidence in the U.S. military. And then the rest of the list has a range of statements that they can agree with or disagree with. Some that you have a high confidence, you have other reasons to know most people will agree with. Like number 1 there. It's not 100%, but it's very, very, very high. And then the other one, the one where you have a high expectation that they're going to disagree with, and that is confidence in the local Department of Motor Vehicles. I'm not sure how it is here in the UK, but the DMV is the most loathed institution in the United States. And so that gives us numbers that we know it's not going to drop below 1, and we know it's not going to get to 6 because most people are not going to agree with number 4. And so then you can compare the responses for those who got just 5 with those who got 6, and you compare the difference between those 2 groups to a separate question that you've asked, where you just ask the straight question, and that's where you would get the social desirability. If you just ask it straight with none of the treatments, that number contains with it this social bias. So here's how it works. Look at the bottom. The control, if you don't ask about the military, you get about 3.2. That's the average number of things they say they agree with. And if you ask about 3.94, ask about the military, it goes up by 72 percentage points. So that tells you that that's the number of people who truly have a confidence and would agree with that statement when you're not measuring it directly. That's revealed through the design. But when you ask directly, you get 86% who would say it. And so the difference between that's the percentage of social desirability bias. And in other words, we find about 14 percentage points of bias. Which is not surprising. It means that it's not entirely driven by social desirability bias, but that's a pretty significant boost up from there. So let me wrap up here. What do we know? We know that there's these social desirability effects that I said. We know that the support for the military is propped up by perceptions of competence. That Afghanistan treatment shows that you can, if you play with the competence frame, you can move public support in one direction or the other. And we know that there are very strong partisan effects, that what moves Democrats is different from what moves Republicans and independents. We think it's sensitive to ethical concerns. That's that surprise that even mentioning any ethics lowered the support. And I didn't put the information up there, but we know from other work that we're doing right now that it's related to confidence in other institutions, but in unusual ways. So for Democrats, confidence in the military tracks with their confidence in other institutions. But for Republicans, it moves in opposite directions, meaning that over time, the Republicans have transferred their confidence to the military as their confidence in other institutions have gone down. Am I stating that clearly? It's a substitution effect for Republicans. For Democrats, it's rather a confidence in good governance kind of thing. For Republicans, it's this is the last institution that works effect. We don't know what to make of polarization. I can give you speculations about what it means. It's deeply troubling, I think, and it fits other data other findings and other research that shows the public has a very poor understanding of civil military norms and very weak support for what we would call best practices of civil military relations. Do this, don't do that. The public does not support those norms, and is fine, or claims to be fine, with the military doing all sorts of things that would cause people like me to clutch their pearls and fall on the fainting couch. Public says, go ahead. How this matters for other things we care about, that's in our data, but we haven't started analyzing it yet, and we're going to do a second wave in the spring to home in on that. But why don't I stop there, and happy to take questions on this research or on the larger issue of American Civil Mil. I guess you'll be my moderator.
Yeah, sure. Well, the form is, if you catch my eye, I'll ask you to pose a question or a comment. And when I do, if you could tell us who you are and the organisation you come from. But, Peter, may I use the chairman's privilege and put the first one to you? If I was the Defence Secretary or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or for that matter any of the service chiefs or the service secretaries, should I be content with this or should I be concerned?
Well, it's a fact that the American military are preoccupied at the leadership level, the brass level, preoccupied with this polling question. You cannot talk to a military officer for above the rank of general for more than 5 minutes before this poll number will enter the conversation. So they are acutely aware that the public holds them in high regard, and they are variously encouraged by it as they look around the rest of what appears to be a dysfunctional polity, and they're worried that it could drop. And at the same time, they're worried that it doesn't seem to track with other things that they care more about. So the public will buy them a cup of coffee in the airport and thank them for their service, but then will also tolerate a sequester which cuts the defense budget in very nefarious ways. And so the public's, it's a lip service. Thanks for your lip service is the way we described it. And the military worries about that. So there's plenty for the military to be worried about. It would be worse if we said, if fever was right 20 years ago and you're headed into the tank now, that would make them more worried. So I think they're reassured that it stayed this high. The last point I'd make is the partisan identity. Even if that doesn't seem to bother ordinary Americans, that really concerns general and flag officers. And this allows me to make a point related to the first basket of issues. You could argue that in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, senior military were too close, too influential with the president, with all, General Kelly, General McMaster, General Mattis, et cetera, all in senior positions. In the last year, they're too distant. They feel like they've gone from being hugged too tightly to now out of the room. And repeatedly the president is making decisions big, like the withdrawal from Syria, or small, like the interference on whether the SEAL can keep his trident. But he's making these decisions without consulting with the military, without their voice seeming to have any influence. And so they worry that they may become to Republicans what African Americans feel they've become to Democrats, a captive interest group that you don't have to care for because they're in your camp, and African Americans have been very frustrated with the level of actual policy support they get from Democratic leaders, even from President Obama. There was some concern that he had not delivered on policy terms, and where will they go politically? They're not going to go to the Republican Party, and so they're kind of taken for granted. That is a concern that the senior military have, that if they're viewed as an interest group, this is bad for professionalism, but it's also bad for policy. They end up not getting the policies they need, or feel they need.
Okay, gentleman over on the right.
Thank you, Professor Beaver. My name is Andrew Payne. I'm a research fellow at Oxford and board member at Chatham House. I have two brief questions, but they're kind of combined. So, the public has very high confidence in the military. They see them through political lens, and they make no distinction between uniformed officers, active duty uniformed officers, and retired generals.
Yes. So,
there's a risk. We talk about the politicization of the military, but the uniformed military can behave perfectly according to civil military norms, i.e., apolitically, and yet because the public see them as through political lens, and retired generals are quite often increasingly intervening in partisan politics, they become effectively politicised for their own. So how corrosive is that to healthy civil-military relations? And second, drawing on your own experience perhaps, what implications does this have for presidential decision-making, given that the president has to take into account public opinion, regardless of whether it's completely misconceived? And perhaps you could explore that. I've been looking at some of the stuff about the surge, the revolt of the generals in 2006, the midterm campaigns going on. So how can presidents best manage that?
Okay. So, yes, even if the military behaved perfectly, the underlying dynamics may still cause a politicization. You're right. However, they haven't behaved perfectly. So part of my mission is to try to focus senior military leaders on ways they can improve their behavior so as to minimize this problem rather than exacerbate it. And the most obvious one is to stay out of campaign politics. And this, every 4 years, there's an unseemly parade of retired general and flag officers who endorse the one presidential candidate or another, and there's strong pushback from the existing military leadership. First Admiral Mullen, then General Dempsey, then General Dunford, and I know that General Milley feels the same way. Messaging to retired community, stop doing this. This is politicizing the force, and it is making our job more difficult because, of course, they have to build a trust relationship with the occupant of the Oval, regardless of what party, regardless of who wins, and it's harder to do when the occupant is looking at you with a fisheye of, are you going to be the next guy to endorse my opponent in the next election? And so there are things that they're doing, or not everyone is doing, but some people are doing that you could criticize. And so I've merely criticized them. Even though one of my arguments, namely, do this and it's going to undermine public confidence in you, I probably can't use that argument quite as bombastically as I have, because the evidence suggests it won't. Now, for the second one, here I do think there's a difference between the U.S. and the U.K. to the extent I know. And what I know about the U.K. is what Hugh tells me. So if I'm wrong, it's because of Hugh. But in the U.S., effectively, there has been no true anti-war movement. Not that mattered in 9/11. The peak of the anti-war movement was 06, 07. So it lasted sort of from, I would say, March of 06 to September of 07. I can date its end. It's the date of the Petraeus-Crocker hearings. That lanced the boil. And from that point on, it was a permissive environment for Afghanistan and Iraq. And political leaders could do what they wanted. And of course, Obama wanted out and blamed public pressure as part of the reason why he had to get out. But that was not an honest assessment of the actual political pressure. He had plenty of space. And he expended zero political capital in mobilizing public support. So he could have done more and paid very little price, actually, for the choices that he made up or down on Afghanistan and Iraq. So unlike Vietnam, where you had a society ripped apart, you had actual protests, you had people dying literally in protest, and you had lots of price that Johnson paid, eventually Nixon paid. There's nothing like that since 9/11. And so I describe military policy as a zone of choice rather than necessity in this area. You can still debate the choices, were they wise or unwise, but public pressure was not the dominant feature. Even now, except for that one moment in the late Bush years, or middle Bush years, I should say, and of course that did contribute to a review of the Iraq strategy, but the president chose the unpopular answer. So even then, at the height of the anti-war pressure, the president had the political space to choose the opposite, and he prevailed. So that's my sort of answer on public support. I'll just add one more point. When presidents don't spend political capital mobilizing public support, however, pernicious things can happen, and that's what happened in Obama. The McChrystal saga of McChrystal getting fired because of the Rolling Stones article. But if you pull the thread, well, why did that happen? It happened, the ancient history of it is, it happened because McChrystal judged that the president was not doing enough to promote public support for Afghanistan, because the president stopped messaging on Afghanistan. And McChrystal was trying to generate public support, particularly in the demographics where the support was softest, Rolling Stone readers. And so he invites a freelancer for Rolling Stone, or it's his PA who does it. And why in the hell was Hastings in the room able to see the things he saw and report on? It's because McChrystal was trying to do the work that he had seen Petraeus do of propping up public support. Petraeus because Bush was trying but not effective. McChrystal because Obama wasn't trying. So, and of course it backfired on McChrystal. He ends up getting fired for it. So it's not as if there's not second or third order effects from this dynamic, but it's still a zone of choice. Long answer to two great questions. Sorry, I must have offended Hugh, but take care, Hugh.
I've got half a dozen questions. So, you had a first mover advantage and asked two very long questions.
No,
which
it's my fault.
prompted very interesting results. What I want now is a single question or a single comment delivered succinctly in a single sentence.
And I will be brief.
So I'll call on the gentleman in the open shirt on the aisle first.
Hi, Mark Marshall, former UK military, now working for the UK state organisation. My question relates to how you define support and whether you have, because it's about visibility, right? So it's, I suppose, rather succinctly, is do you think the US military, the support is sympathy or empathy? And of those two, which should you be going for? It links to Nick Houghton when he was Chief of Defence Staff in the UK. He was saying the British Army was, the support for it was sympathetic when actually he was going for everything.
Right. It's a great point. We have not parsed it. You could do that through our some of the questions we've already asked. We do ask about to what extent do you see the military as sharing your values, to what extent, and we ask other affect questions. The short answer, the dynamic you see here in the UK, sympathy not empathy, we see in the United States. That was partly shaped by a strategic choice that the Democrats, the out party, made during the Iraq War, where they didn't want to make the mistake they made in the Vietnam War and be anti-military, but they also didn't want to support Bush's policy. And the solution they hit on, it was a political solution, was let's describe the military as the victims of Bush policy, and we can be support the victim and opposed to the policy. And so you'd have things like, I love the troops so much I want them to come home now, this kind of thing. And they would pick as their symbols of the military wounded veterans rather than people who had conducted heroism under fire necessarily. And so we saw a little bit of that dynamic in the United States. I think it's been much amplified here in UK, so I understand from people like you and others who've studied it. The empathy is a big problem, and if you have one sentence to state about America's problems today, you would say there's an empathy gap across every division: race, political, class, and veteran, non-veteran, an incapacity to see through the eyes of the other, stand in the shoes of the other, and see what it looks like. And that one empathy gap, I think explains most of U.S. problems. And so it does show up in the military context of just an inability to understand what it must be like. And I'll make one last statement in this respect. Most of the Americans who thank a soldier for his service, and that is a thing in the United States. I'm not sure if that's a thing here, but it is a thing. If you see a soldier in uniform in the airport or whatever, they will be thanked for their service. Most of the people who do that sincerely, genuinely are thankful, and maybe there's a little bit, I'm glad you're serving, not me. It could be a little bit of that, but it's a genuine expression of affect. Many of the military people who receive that don't like it and feel like it's lip service, feel like it puts them in an awkward. They like to get in the front of the line to get on the airplane, but the rest of it they don't like. And so even there's an empathy gap that shows up in that. You're trying to do something that is showing love, and it's not being felt like love.
I'm going to start brigading questions together now.
I'm bad, am I? I'm just
no, don't worry. And you're probably going to consider me a chairman who has an empathy deficit. But can you please keep your remarks very short, single point, single sentence. Lady in the middle over there.
Hello, I'm Christina Brandy from the Center for European Reform. I have a question about the pattern of bipartisan support into the military. Do you think that the current impeachment inquiry into Trump, where we have some security and military establishment on the opposite side, do you think it will affect democratic perception of military as something more favorable?
Gosh, that's a very relevant question. Thank you. And the gentleman just in front of you.
Khalid Najim, South Asian Police Forum. Yesterday I was at an embassy reception and I had an interesting conversation with Sir Michael Fallon, former Secretary of State for Defence.
I know.
Subject was Saudi Arabia.
Can you just put the question?
Yeah, I'm going to put the question. I said, do we support Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of Jamal Khashoggi, MBS? What should we do? And he said, we have to support Saudi Arabia. There are loyal ally, we exchange of intelligence. We have no choice, and this is going to continue. What is the American military point of view? What is the view of the American public? What is the view of Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Two very interesting questions.
Okay, so let me deal with the first one. What we're seeing is the Republicans turning on Vindman, the lieutenant colonel who testified. And I don't have polling data to support this, but I have lots of emails from an angry Trump supporter that can serve as my anecdata. View that as a betrayal. The way you would view one of your side, turning on your own, so that this tribal identity. How dare he criticize? He's one of us. He shouldn't have done that. It's a traitor. They use that kind of language. And of course, you suddenly see the Democrats wrapping themselves in military service. Look at, you can't question this man. He's a service member. How could you dare question his, any judgment he makes? So it's temporarily flipped. Of course, the brass would wish he had not been there. Wish if he had gone, he hadn't worn his uniform, and wish the whole thing would go away. The Milley is in a lose-lose. That's our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's in a lose-lose position in this impeachment, and one of the many, regardless of what happens, one of the casualties, the collateral damage, will be Milley's relationship with the president, which is going to be worse on the other side of this than it was at the beginning. That's unfortunate. Milley's done nothing wrong, but he's just a collateral damage. On Saudi Arabia, the public has not engaged on this issue. It's an elite debate, not a mass public debate. The elite debate is sharply divided between those who say, look, the world's a nasty place and we have to, get our oil wherever we can kind of thing, versus this is exactly the kind of misrule that we turned a blind eye to before, and it bit us in 9/11. And so the elite debate is replaying the freedom agenda arguments that were popular during the Bush administration. President Trump's made his bet squarely with MBS, and I don't expect any change unless Saudi Arabia were to break with Israel. So that if MBS broke with Israel in some profound public way, that might shift the president's views.
What military view of this?
I don't know the answer. I haven't asked senior military about it. Obviously, we have military cooperation that has to continue, and let me just qualify that. I know that there's deep anger inside the military over some of the weapons that leaked into the anti-Houthi campaign. They weren't supposed to leak into that, and they did leak into that, and that was the senior military are angry about that. That's quite a narrow issue.
Okay, on the right-hand side, there's two very patient ladies at the back, one on the aisle.
Thank you. Sarah Ingham, I was delighted to quote you in my doctoral thesis on military covenant, which is the paradigm in this country through which we now see the civil-military relationship. I'm wondering, in your research, how much you drilled down into this definition of the military, and whether your respondents had a view of whether it related to frontline combat or perhaps the rear echelon activity. And does that colour their view of military support, given the reverence there is for combat itself?
That's a very useful question. And the lady next to you?
Ravisa Mundine, I'm politics analyst at SOAS. My question is, have you seen a number of participation in other defensive institutions such as the police watchdog as well, and even your intelligence agencies, and would that help explaining why numbers in the military drop?
Okay, so we did not drill down to the level of combat, non-combat. only so many questions we could ask. So my expectation would be that the public does not distinguish between that. That's a level of detail that, of course, matters greatly within the military, but the public, I guess I can't overemphasize the ignorance, the unknowingness of the American public about the military. And so I don't know that they would draw such sharp distinctions. One of the big demographic shifts is the decline in families that have a personal connection to the military. Just as the draft era literally dies off, the many families, now it's only about 17%, that would have a personal connection, someone that they could talk to over Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas dinner, about what war was like. And so the vast majority of public is just getting their information at football games, and heroes come out and they're thanked and things like that. And there are not a lot of personal connections where these kinds of details would surface. And then in answer to your question, the military ranks higher than other security services. The police has a strong racial gap, domestic police kinds of things, with African Americans very low confidence in police forces, and whites higher confidence in police forces. The one other group that seems to perform at this level is emergency responders. Firemen, healthcare workers who rush to ambulance, that kind of thing. They are also held in high esteem. And if you put it together, you get a picture of the American public that sort of views all of these as, in case of emergency, break glass, these people run to your rescue, and the military is viewed as that as well. Of course, it has pernicious policy effects, because the Americans keep asking the military to address problems that might not be military in nature. Building the wall on the border between Mexico, that becomes a military assignment when, of course, it's not a military mission.
There's been three gentlemen over on the right, all of whom have been very patient. Ewan Grant?
Yeah, thank you very much. Ewan Grant, former Customs and Excise law enforcement analyst covering the ex-Soviet states. My question is, who is listening to you and your colleague from...
Not nearly enough.
From the European NATO states and from the central bureaucracy of the European Union as it starts to try and build a defensive security dimension.
Desmond, did you have a... Okay, and Andrew Brooks.
Andrew Brooks, member. Geography and culture, how do you factor in things like your response, say, from a blue-collar worker in Mississippi? It's probably going to be different from a vegan lentil eater in California.
Yes.
How do you factor that in?
Right. Okay, so the first question I can answer briefly, nobody. But in part, this... Yes. However, they haven't had a chance to, so this is very fresh, where it's work in progress, candidly. And I'll be on sabbatical next year to hopefully finish it up. And I'll be here, not here in London, well, hopefully, linked a little bit to London, but also at Oxford. And that's when we'll want to be taking the dog and pony on the show, and I would love to go to Brussels and give them lessons learned from the American experience. I do wonder how much these things move in concert. My sense is that support for the military is a public religion dimension in America. It's a civic religion that is not replicated here. You might have other civic religious elements, but you cannot have a public ceremony in America without a military dimension to it. And my favorite anecdote of this is that we before every basketball game, they bring out the flag with a military honor guard. We sing the national anthem, and then the flag marches off. And for some reason, there was the military unit was not available. And they said, well, what can we do? We have to have the flag, but we have no one to hold it. And I said, civilians are allowed to hold the flag. That would actually be a very patriotic thing to do, to have an honor guard of civilians. And it just did not resonate with the planners of the organization. That would be blasphemous. This is a military role. And I think that's an American pernicious development, not a European problem. So maybe some of the lessons don't translate. But I'd love to find out, particularly over wine in Brussels, what could be better than that. Beer, okay, fair enough. And the other question
Geography.
Yes. So in America, it's called the recruiter's smile. And there's a sort of a U like that cuts from the Midwest mountain down through the south and then up, but stops before you get to the New England. That's where all of the U.S. troops come from. And nothing on the coasts and nothing in New England. That's where recruiters meet their targets. So there's a strong geographic division. And one of the markers of whether you're likely to serve is whether your family member serves. So this geography thing is self-reinforcing, because if you have no one in your family who were recruited before, then there's no one to mobilize you to serve the next generation, and so on. So there's absolutely a geographic dimension to propensity to serve. But what's unusual about this high confidence is that seems to be across regardless of whether you're likely to serve. In fact, it does not correlate much with likelihood to serve. People who are likely to serve has even higher levels of confidence, but you can be a vegan something or other on the coast and still report remarkably high levels of confidence in the military relative to what you might expect. It is that last institution that the public thinks is working and it's doing what it should be doing.
Well, thank you very much. So no more questions. I am minded when you asked the question on attitudes within the military towards the difficult issues surrounding Saudi Arabia. That this weekend is the ISS Manama Dialogue in Bahrain, where foreign ministers from the region and important extra-regional powers are gathered. Much of it is in public and it will be being live streamed, and our people in the conference venue are going to be tweeting and blogging. So if you're interested in the issues of the region, by all means drop in and out of it electronically. And those of you who are ISS members, you should have recently received your copy of the 2019 Strategic Survey. And I'd really commend to you the Middle East chapter as a really incisive summary of those very challenging cross-currents within the region. But I think it's very rare here at the ISS to have a statistics-heavy presentation. But you've really brought it to life and showed us how, from the bare bones of the statistics, you can really extract some stimulating insights, particularly as it's only about 10 days ago that the whole country did its national ceremony of remembrance, from Whitehall down to local village war memorials. Would you please join me in thanking Professor Feeback?